for people who live alone, this has been so huge. We're just already isolated as a Western society as it is, but now it's like even more so. So I noticed, and I see this with my colleagues as well, oftentimes, especially those who live alone like me, it's you kind of have social interactions, not always planned, but kind of they kind of happen throughout your life or throughout your days. So, you know, you go to the gym, you see some of your friends, you kind of go out for dinner, like, hey, I'm in the area, blah, blah, blah. And it never really is too intentional, maybe sometimes. But now with the pandemic, it's like, boom, gone. So there's this huge gap, and you can't overstate it, because social support, there's so much research that shows that it makes such a huge difference. And when we don't have that, it has like tremendous impact. So just to kind of underscore that point and highlight it even more, the human brain is made to be very relational. Our bodies are made to be relational. God has designed us for attachment, for relationships. So I always talk about this study that was done like way back in the 1800s. This German linguist, he thought that if, you know, if babies are not taught any language, that they're going to naturally grow up to speak German, right? Like, so he wanted to prove this theory by actually like having babies isolated from anybody else, from any caregiver. The nurses would come, they weren't allowed to speak to the children. They weren't really allowed to touch them. They had to kind of like change their diapers with prongs and stuff like that. And what the research showed, or that study showed, is actually all of those children died. Attachment, relationships with people, it's actually not the icing on the cake. You know, we think like, oh, it would be nice to have friends, or it would be nice to have like relationships with people. No, it's actually at the level of a basic survival need. It's that important. Then you also look at anybody who works in the jail system, in the prison system, knows that people, and prisoners will tell you this, people who go into solitary confinement, there is something that happens, especially the longer it is. They just don't ever really come out the same. We need human interaction. I thought it was really interesting that the unit of survival in a concentration camp, they went back and did this research and looked back, like the probability of surviving was a unit of 2 or more. So if you were in a concentration camp and you had somebody you were really connected with and close with, your probability of surviving was much higher than if you were alone. And of course, 10 Commandments are extremely relational. It's all about our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. So you kind of get the message. We need other people. And COVID, pandemic, lockdown, all these things, they really, really get in the way of that. And it makes it so difficult. Healthy relationships, predictor of happiness, resilience to stress, and trauma. It helps us regulate our emotions better and lower susceptibility to anxiety and depression. The list goes on and on and on, but again, you get the point. Being alone is so difficult. And again, because we're wired to be so relational, it's to the point where God has literally said that it's not good for man to be alone. It's not good or healthy for us. It doesn't produce anything great when we're alone. So that kind of inflates the whole point. Yeah, and this other thing about uncertainty, which I kind of covered, is that it's really difficult to know, when is this going to end? Is there a third wave coming? What's going to happen to my schooling? What about internships and co-ops and all that stuff? And that place of uncertainty, our brain really doesn't like. So that makes it really difficult as well. Okay, so went over some of the reasons why it might be difficult. Now, the real good stuff. How do we cope? Like, what can we do? So what I'm going to say about this is that when it comes to coping, it is more than just, okay, yeah. So Nina talked about exercise. Yeah, so I'll do that like next week and then I should be better, right? Like, And then you'll go and exercise, and then you'll be like, seriously, Nina, it didn't help. So here's what I want to say to you. These are not like things that you do once and then forget about. These are things to incorporate into your life. That's one. The other thing is that if you have all these, but you don't have healthy relationships with other people, none of this is going to make a huge difference. So you cannot just take skills or like ideas and not incorporate them into community. There has to be an aspect of relational health. Okay, so hopefully that's clear, and then we can kind of get into it. So Genesis, when you look at Genesis, chapter 1 talks about how God creates the earth, puts the inhabitants in there. He brings Eve to Adam. They meet. Wow, awesome, cool. And then Genesis chapter 3 is the fall of man. So within that, what happens is there's all these broken relationships that result, right? So there's a broken relationship with self, and we start to see ourselves in a untruthful way. There's a broken relationship with God in the way that we view God and even like our connection to God. Broken relationship with other people, Adam and Eve being a prime example, and a broken relationship with the environment and how we treat what God has given us. Now, what God is trying to do with us is he's working to restore what is taking place. It says, but we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. So essentially, the work that God is doing here on earth is he is working on restoring those 4 relationships. Those 4 relationships that have been broken, he's working to bring them back into harmony. So when we talk about actually taking care of our health, taking care of our relationships with other people, we're actually taking part in this work of restoration, which I think is so exciting and so cool, because it's more than just, oh, I don't want to feel like this anymore. Like, actually, when I work on myself, when I allow for myself to have better emotional and mental well-being, it is actually doing the work of the Holy Spirit inside of me. So, practical tools. One of the things that I think is so maybe underrated, I don't know, but is boundaries. Like, boundaries is one of the most important skills that we can ever learn as human beings. And I don't think we learn them well enough. And I think sometimes in Christianity, it is hard for us to have boundaries because the message we get, it's like, well, I'm not allowed to say no because that's unkind, or, like I have to, like, almost the image we have is that we have to be boundaryless, and that's what love is. When in actuality, it's quite different. But what are boundaries? They are essentially, think of them as like a fence around your house. They're limits or rules or lines that separate us and other people. So that's why we can say like, oh, you crossed the line. That's when we say like a boundary has been broken. And those guidelines are basically, those boundaries are, tell us about what is permissible in how other people treat us and how we treat others. And they change in the context, right? With who, when, and they can be flexible, but they're really, really important. So for example, my boundaries with my sister are going to be really different from my boundaries with a stranger on the street, right? But there's still boundaries nonetheless. And those boundaries, they go to physical, they go to emotional, sexual, material, time. There's just so many of those boundaries. And you have to look at boundaries as more than just rules. They're kind of like fences that are really protective, like they're for your good. So learning to set boundaries is so crucial. They keep us safe. They actually reduce resentment. If we had better boundaries, we would be less resentful of people. It helps us to actually have healthy relationships that are respectful, that are safe. It is a form of self-care, and it reduces the chaos, because when you have a boundary, you're able to say, okay, this is where I end and you begin. So this is not my stuff. This is your stuff. Like, this is on this side of the fence. And it helps us to not take on things that are not ours, which a lot of people tend to do. So here's an example of an important boundary that God has given us, and that's the Sabbath. It's like literally a hedge that he's put around the seventh day to say, like, okay, on this day, you are going to just rest. That is your boundary. And it's not so much a rule as it is like, this is what is permissible. This is what you're going to protect. This is what you're going to like really thrive on. And that's the Sabbath. And if we really understood the Sabbath as a boundary, I think it would change our relationship with the Sabbath, and kind of help us to see, like, wow, what the Bible says, like the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So, important habits. These are just really good things for us to do. And like I said, these are things that we need to do consistently and not just do it once and expect results. So quality sleep, really, 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 really important, like cannot be overstated. Nutrition, consuming water. And this does not include tea, coffee, juice, any of that stuff that people think counts towards their water consumption. No, just actual plain water. Sabbath, boundaries. These are all good things for us to continue to do. Self-care. So let's talk about self-care, because it's like this popular buzzword that everybody talks about. Find Gen Z talks about this a lot. Like, oh yeah, this is for my mental health. I'm going to do some self-care. That's really awesome. But I want to really differentiate the difference between self-care and self-soothing, because what a lot of people talk about as self-care could actually be called self-soothing. So what's the difference? Self-care is about doing something that is good for you. Self-soothing is doing something that feels good to you. For example, going on a run doesn't necessarily feel good in the moment, but it could be really good for you. Taking a bubble bath could be considered self-soothing, because like it's more about soothing what's going on than actively choosing to do things that are good for you. So self-care doesn't always feel pleasant. A really good example of that is with boundaries. Setting boundaries is really good self-care. But let me tell you, it does not feel good for most people. It doesn't feel good to be like, nope, I don't want to do that. Nope, this is not going to work for me right now. Actually, I can't commit to that. It feels really difficult, especially if people are, tend to be people pleasers. It's very hard. But guess what? It is so good for us to be able to set boundaries. So don't look at self-care. When you think about self-care, don't just think about how it feels for you in the moment. Really focus on, is this going to like contribute to my health? Is this good for me? And I don't want to like downplay self-soothing. It's important. But I'll tell you, when I was a student and I was in grad school, I remember I had a really difficult session. And I remember going to my supervisor afterwards and I said, like, I was so stressed out. All I wanted to do was go home and eat like a giant pizza. And it's like, that's not self-care. That is self-soothing. And sometimes there's a time and place for that. But self-care is what we really need to like consistently build into our lives. So I hope that kind of differentiates the two. So another thing, journaling, really huge, super helpful. But really to see the impact of journaling, what I've noticed is that it cannot be, people don't find a huge help in journaling if they do it once or twice or inconsistently. Journaling, it's like a long-term game. You really get a big difference when you do it consistently. It helps people to be more self-aware, and it slows down your brain and engages it in a very different way than if you're talking about it, than if you're typing it out. Journaling, huge, huge, huge. Okay, this one I've been so excited to share with you guys. I've been learning about it recently, and I think it is just like the coolest thing ever. So, being present. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I think I have a slide on this later, but being present is so important for our health. So, being present means that I am here in this moment versus like when I'm talking to you, I'm like on my phone checking out what my sister ate for breakfast this morning. Not that I care, but like whatever it may be. Or I am trying to do this essay, but I'm actually worrying about last week's exam. So being present is not any of those things. It's actually being like here in the moment, not the worries for the past or the worries for the future. It's like right here in this moment. And I'll tell you guys a little bit later, like why that's so important, because the research is catching up of like how crucial, like critical it is for our health. Okay. Gratitude. So another huge thing. So we talk about gratitude a lot in our society, and I think it can get really annoying because like, what? I have to be grateful now for everything? Like, is this Thanksgiving every day? But I'm telling you, this has literally changed my life. I'm a very pessimistic person by nature, and our brains tend to look at the negative in general, unless we really train it not to, because it's a survival mechanism, really. And I think it has a lot to do with sin, just like our fallen nature, our fallen condition. But gratitude, oh my word, keeping a gratitude journal or even like speaking out loud, it does wonders for changing our brain. And there's so much research that's coming out about the importance of gratitude and how much it actually changes the structural brain. It's like not just like, oh, I feel better. It's like it literally changes your brain. That's crazy. So it trains our body to sit with joy. And I had this on the other slide that joy is actually one of the most difficult emotions for us to sit with as human beings. We often think that, oh, a really hard emotion is like sadness. Actually, sadness is probably much easier for us to sit with than joy. Most of us in the Western culture cannot sit with joy for very long. I'm not sure about other cultures, but I can tell you for sure, Western culture, we have a very hard time sitting with joy. And you can see this one day if you ever have something exciting happen to you and you talk to a friend, notice how long that moment of joy sits with you. It won't be very long. It's like, oh, hey, guess what happened? And then you just kind of like, eh. So training our body to sit with joy is what gratitude does. It helps us expand our capacity to sit with joy. Okay, I'm actually excited about this one too. This one, I've been looking for this chart for a while now, and I finally found it yesterday. Avoidance. So all of us, especially students who procrastinate a lot, are experts at avoidance. So when something feels really uncomfortable for us, we tend to avoid it. That is like a flight response. It's not a fight response, it's a flight response. Now, what happens is that when we avoid something, our anxiety after avoiding it actually increases. So this is what's ballistic to me. If you have a stimulus that you're like avoiding, let's say I'm really afraid of driving on bridges and I avoid it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this other route to not drive on a bridge. So my anxiety is like high when I think about driving on a bridge, and then it goes down because I've avoided it. And it's like, yay, it feels so good. But what happens is the second time I come around to that stimulus, I actually have more anxiety than I did the first time. And that's like crazy. We're actually not avoiding anything. Like we're not helping ourselves. We're not doing ourselves any favors when we avoid something that's actually really important, right? So it's kind of difficult to find routes around bridges all the time because usually there's a bridge because there's water in the way. So yeah, like essentially avoidance oh, if we can learn to kind of sit through those difficult, uncomfortable emotions, it will be so much more helpful to us than each time like kind of navigating our lives in a way that just tries to get rid of that thing. Okay, so I want you all, wherever you are, whether I can see you or not, just take a breath right now, like a really deep breath. Okay, so how many of you, I'm going to open this chat because I can't see anything here. How many of you, when you took a breath, you raised your shoulders? Just tell me in the chat. Did your shoulders go up when you took a breath? Okay. 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 So I kind of like half tricked you guys. Sorry, but one of the other things is that for whatever reason, as adults, when we breathe, for some reason, we've been like taught how to breathe incorrectly, and it kind of leads to a lot of problems in our lives. So people who take a deep breath like this, what happens is they take very shallow breaths. They're like taking a breath from up here, when really we need to be breathing from our diaphragm. And when we take shallow breaths, you can watch like TED Talks on this. It's very, very interesting. Like when we take shallow breaths, we engage these muscles, the traps. And the traps were never meant to be part of our breathing. So we engage these like thousands upon thousands of times per day. That's why when people are stressed, it shows up in here. This is really tight because this is like overworking in a way it should not be working at all. So if you go to a massage therapist, they can tell, they'll be like, oh, you're really stressed, hey? And that's because of this. And when we are in our fight or flight mode, when we're stressed, we tend to breathe from here because there's no time for like deep breathing. We're like, gotta get out of here, right? So consciously changing our breath to make it like deep breath versus shallow breathing. Actually, what it does is, you know, that PNS and SNS, parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, when we change our breath, it actually turns on our parasympathetic nervous system. It helps our body to just really calm down. It's like, okay, we're safe. And it's like a light switch. It really is that amazing. And I'll tell you guys the secret. The secret is in your exhale. The longer you can make your exhale, it turns on your vagus nerve, and it's like this long nerve that goes from here to your gut. The more that you can take your exhale and just lengthen it and elongate it, it's going to be so much better for turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. So what the research is showing is not the inhale so much as it is the exhale. So there's a trick for you guys. But I think if we learn to breathe correctly, it would make such a huge difference because we carry stress in our bodies all day, every day without even recognizing that. So breathing. Breathing affects your sleep, your back, your shoulder, neck pain, digestion, memory, anxiety, your immune system, your adrenal glands, all that stuff. So if you want to really, really have way more, almost like more peace or more of the parasympathetic nervous system turned on, you have to learn how to breathe correctly. And you have to retrain your body to breathe correctly. Some of you, it looks like in the chat already, like breathe correctly. And I find that a lot of singers tend to breathe correctly because I guess your training teaches you to like dig deep into your diaphragm. But yeah, so huge. I just like huge, huge, huge. Okay, this is the research I was going to tell you guys about. So anybody who is not a sciencey person, I implore you, don't turn off your brain, because I know for me, I'm not the most sciencey person. I did like lots of like writing type stuff in undergrad. I did anthropology and whatnot. but don't turn off your brain. Like, this is going to be simple enough to understand. But the research on being present is crazy. So we have these things called telomeres, and telomeres are at the end of the chromosomes. They're like these like caps that protect the chromosomes, kind of like the plastic cap at the end of your shoelace that kind of keeps it from getting like frayed. It's these things that are at the end, and they protect the chromosomes themselves. What happens is that each time the cell copies itself to replenish, telomeres, they get shorter and shorter. And as they get shorter each time, they get to the point where there is nothing left, and the cell, it ages and it stops functioning properly, and it dies eventually. So when they talk about, have you guys ever heard of like biological age versus chronological age? It's like, you're actually, 54 in your biological age, but you're 29, So this is how they calculate, part of how they calculate your biological age, which is your telomere length. Because telomeres, it's so indicative of aging. So there's a lot of research about telomeres. Somebody won a Nobel Prize for it because it tells us about people dying. It tells us about like functioning going down, all of these things. So what they're finding is that things that shorten telomeres are aging in general. Like as we age, all of us, our telomeres are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Obesity kind of like shortens telomeres, stress, lack of exercise, poor diet, all of these things shorten telomeres. And with short telomeres, it's I guess like the impact of it is we age faster, and honestly, we die faster. Kind of morbid, but it's true. But there is hope, because what they're finding in the research is there's this enzyme called Telomerase, and it actually can help stop, slow, and in some cases, it can reverse the shortening. So you can imagine a lot of like the beauty industry, a lot of the healthcare industry is super interested in it, because if we can actually get more telomerase, it will do so much for our longevity, for aging, all this stuff. So my point, what the research is showing is that being present actually lengthens it produces more telomerase, which in turn actually lengthens your telomeres. So the finding is pretty, I was trying to see where the study was from. I think it's from UCLA, but it's pretty incredible because there's something about us being really in the moment that promotes our health and our well-being. And when you think about it, it's like, this makes sense. In the Bible, it says, when Jesus is talking, he's saying, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow is going to be anxious about itself. Like, sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Like, Jesus really invites us to be present, like, be here, be now, be still, right? There's this continuous theme and message in the Bible about being present. And when you look at our society, we are so much about multitasking. We're so big on it. We're like, eating our dinner while watching YouTube, while responding to a text, while checking an Instagram post, right? Like, we're doing so many different things, and our attention is so scattered. And I was saying to Victoria this morning, I noticed that even in lockdown, my attention span is so much shorter. Like, I've been doing some professional development stuff, listening to lectures, and it's just like, I get so distracted so easily. Like, all of a sudden I'm like not listening to anything that's going on. I'm responding to emails. And it's really that, like, our ability to be present is something that we have to grow. Our capacity to be present, we have to grow it and make it bigger. So honestly, I think this is so powerful and life-changing. If we can learn to be present and really present, it actually has benefits for aging, for health, all those things. Okay, I have to say this because exercise is so important. exercise. We talk about it all the time, but nobody really talks about how much exercise we need. So what the research shows, I haven't looked at the more recent research, so I don't know. But last time I checked, for stress reduction, if you want to get benefits from that, you have to exercise at least 3 times a week. From what I've heard, I think they're saying it has to be a little bit more, the majority of the week. And it needs to be at least 30 minutes long, and you have to break a sweat. So whatever it is you choose to do is whatever, it doesn't matter. But as long as it meets that criteria, it's going to be really important for actually gaining the benefits of stress reduction. Okay, how much time do we have here? All right, I am going to talk briefly about this and probably just go into answering some questions. So how many of you, I'm going to open the chat again, how many of you have ever heard of Eudaimonia or Hedonia? Just let me know. Ever heard of both of them or neither? Okay. So Eudaimonia and Hedonia, they're 2 different philosophies about happiness, okay? And people tend to hold one or the other, or they gravitate towards one or the other. So Hedonia is about bodily pleasure. It's about my own pleasure. So hedonistic societies tend to be ones where there's a lot of emphasis on sexual gratification, a lot about your own pleasure, a lot about like your own food intake and appetite, things like that. That's hedonia. And so the philosophy behind it is like you will have pleasure, like your happiness is in the amount of maximizing the pleasure that you have. Okay, so eudaimonia is actually quite different, where the philosophy is that happiness comes from this kind of sense of making meaning and purpose, and also like the good of mankind and the good of society. It's much more like kind of like us versus me, right? Hedonia is very much like my pleasure and my bodily pleasure. Eudaimonia it's much more like us as a society, what is meaningful and deeply rooted in bigger themes. So I don't have the research up here for you, but again, I think this was a study done at UCLA, which was very interesting. What they found is that people who subscribe mostly to hedonia, for whatever, and I don't remember the language that they used, but they were essentially more prone to autoimmune diseases, prone to cancer, prone to illnesses. For whatever reason, like hedonia would like turn on something in their bodies that would make them more prone to those illnesses. And they found that eudaimonia actually did the opposite. It was like a protective factor that like essentially protected people from those diseases. So really crazy, but makes so much sense, especially when you look at throughout the Bible, especially in Revelation, when like God is talking about like hedonism. He doesn't necessarily use that word, but when he describes hedonistic societies, there's like all of these things that are almost like, you think they're like pronouncements of God, but they're like natural consequences for living a life of self-pleasure. So I guess what I mean to say with all of that is in all the things that are going on in, like trying to cope during this pandemic, finding meaning in bigger things, finding meaning in society, in like our collective we, right? Or even finding ways to help other people, like getting gratification and happiness through those means, that is actually you investing into your own health as well, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, very quickly, actually. Yeah, so very quickly, there are things that you can do to activate your PNS, your parasympathetic nervous system. And the more we can activate it, the more that we can like bring our body back into balance. Because for most of us, our SNS is like out of control. So the more we can activate it, we can just bring that harmony back. So we can activate it by deep breathing, something we call also tactical breathing. They do this a lot in the military to help them clear their minds so that they can make good decisions when they have to, when lives are at stake. Being present, being aware of what's going on in our own bodies, doing anything that relaxes our muscles, like a hot bath, massage, foam rolling, stretching. These are all really good things to activate our parasympathetic nervous system. And again, these are not things that you do once and then expect like ginormous results. These are things that you continuously and consistently incorporate into your life to really see the benefit of them. So it's kind of like eating one vegetable. You can't be like, why aren't I healthy? You kind of have to incorporate it into your life. Yeah, you guys know about counseling, community, play. Okay, I am going to check Slido and see what questions there are. All right. So I think we got to be back in like 10 minutes. Okay. So this question is how having a routine helps our mental health. Yeah, I would say so. Our brain likes consistency. I think more than just like helping our mental health, what it does is it helps us to incorporate really good habits to take care of ourselves. So having a routine helps it to not just be like kind of accidental. It helps it to be like, all right, intentional, more than anything else, really. How do you build healthier relationships? Ooh, okay. Well, this is a really big question. I think one of the first things that we need for healthy relationships is to look at ourselves. So whatever patterns we bring to our relationships, especially romantic relationships, it's because of things that are going on inside of us or themes that we kind of bump up against. So just learning about ourselves, like how do I respond when there's conflict? How do I respond when somebody pushes on my boundaries? How do I respond when somebody asks too much of me? How do I respond when somebody puts me down? Like all of these things, they're so, so important for learning about ourselves in the midst of relationships. So how do you build healthier relationships? I would say the first place to start is to work on yourself. Being able to like have more awareness of your own patterns, your own themes, really, really makes a huge difference towards our relationships with others. Okay, all right. I think all these questions are getting mixed up here because people are upvoting them. All right. How to deal with anxiety on a finals week full of assignments. Oh yeah, I've been there. It's not fun. So I think that there's like two answers, right? There's like in the moment, how to deal with the anxiety, and that would be like through coping mechanisms or coping skills, that kind of what I talked about, like doing deep breathing, learning to be present, like journaling, like doing, stretching, all those things to turn on your parasympathetic nervous system. Those are like in the moment. And then like a wider meta lens is more of, what is anxiety like outside of a stressful week for you? Is your anxiety present? Is it low grade? If you can deal with it outside of the finals week, if it's very high, then that's what needs to be looked at. But in the moment, of course, in finals week is not when you're going to be looking at that. It's going to be really like doing whatever you can in that week, right? Like the skills. All right. What are some things we should consider if we want to seek professional counseling? Oh, okay. Yeah, I had a slide on that. I don't know if I can show you guys. I kind of breezed past it. So, what you really want to look for first and foremost is somebody who you can connect well with. That's going to be like one of the biggest, most important factors for change. You want to make sure that they're licensed and registered with a professional body. So if you're in Ontario, they're going to be a registered psychotherapist. You want to make sure that like they actually have the right credentials. Ontario is regulated, but many other provinces are not. So looking at their credentials, that's really good. The other thing is you don't go in with the expectation of finding the right therapist right away. I tell people to almost think of it as kind of like going on blind dates, and like you don't necessarily find the one after one date. You kind of have to like go on a few and before you really know what you're looking for. So don't be afraid to see more than one therapist. Good therapists are going to ask you really good questions that get you to reflect on what's going on inside. And they don't try to like tell you what to think or tell you how to feel, but they help you to kind of sort out what's going on and give you a bit more clarity in what's happening. Okay, how can you help a friend who is having a hard time being present and focusing on the good? Yeah, this is really tough. It's really hard to watch somebody we care about struggling. And here's what I can say to that. You can only do what you can do, right? So this is again where boundaries come into play. You are not responsible for your friend's well-being, right? Like you cannot go to them and be like, all right, you need to focus on good stuff now. Like this is not good for you. Only look at this. That is typically not the most helpful response. What you can do, if you guys have seen like the Brené Brown video about empathy, where you really just like get down to wherever that person is at and listen and sit with them in that place. So I think if we were to look at it really like practically, talking to this person, making space for them. What do you need? How can I help you? Let's talk. And if they say like, I don't want to talk about it, that's their boundary. And we got to respect that. Yeah. And then taking care of our own feelings that come up when somebody around us is not doing well. You'll notice for some people, taking care of other people's emotions is a way that we learn to cope. And sometimes that comes from the kind of family we grow up in. Sometimes that comes with just whatever life circumstances we've been through. So noticing like that is also really good self-awareness and working through it as well. Ooh, okay. How do you build resilience? Oh, that's such a good question. Okay, here's what I was going to say. The literature or the studies on the research on resilience is not very robust, unfortunately. We don't really know why, we don't know with a lot of clarity and certainty why some children tend to be resilient and some are not. So you can have two people go through the same trauma and one will come out with, complex trauma or PTSD and the other won't. We are not, research isn't 100% sure of what the difference is. One of the biggest things though is healthy relationships. Like the healthier your relationships are with other people, more trust and connectedness, the stronger resilience will be. But there's also like a lot of almost like innate factors. I tend to think that some of them are actually genetic as well, that kind of like make us have a stronger propensity for more resilience or not. But yeah, building resilience, such a good question. Whoever asked it. Yeah. Hopefully in the coming years, we'll have more research on it. Okay. How to deal with anxiety in a toxic environment. Oh, that's a tough one. So it depends on a lot of what the circumstances are, right? Like, this toxic environment, is this like home life? Is this workplace? Like how deeply embedded and enmeshed is this environment? So anything you're going to do in terms of dealing with anxiety within a toxic environment, think of it as kind of like putting a few more layers of blankets in a storm, but it doesn't stop the storm, right? So it's not going to cure anything. It's not going to change anything until the environment changes. So it's not fair for anybody to expect of themselves to be rid of anxiety when the environment is the way that it is. So you can only learn to cope through the environment. And then when you're out of that place, like kind of be able to process all that's happened. But don't have an unrealistic expectation of not having anxiety if that's the kind of environment that you're in. If you're actively like working towards getting out of that environment, like, working towards getting a job and being able to move out or whatever it may be, it might be that it's just like coping until you can get out. But yeah, we really can't. We're not designed to be within an environment that is not good for us and to stay in it. We're not designed to just be like water off a duck's back. Okay. Okay, what do I do when fight or flight is triggered? Oh, yes. So, what I would be curious about is fight or flight is being triggered. Is this something that would be, objectively speaking, most people would be triggered by it? For example, you walk in the woods and you see a bear. If it is fight or flight that's being triggered because there is a real danger that's there, this is a healthy response. But the fact that this person is asking it, it probably means that this is not a time where fight or flight is welcomed or where fight or flight is needed. So whatever is triggering there is typically, not 100% of the time, but often there's a lot of trauma or just unresolved stuff that's going on underneath. So yeah, kind of depends on what the triggers are, what's going on. It's something I'd be really curious about, something that can be really good to talk to a professional about as well. You can do things in the moment. So like I said, there's coping skills you can do in the moment, turning on your PNS by deep breathing, reminding yourself that you're safe, all of these things. But they are temporary things. They are band-aids. They are not the healing. If you really want to work through the triggers themselves and like what's happening, you kind of have to go deeper. So there's like the immediate, and then there's like the meta. All right. Okay, I think I got through all of them. Let me just make sure. Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. I don't think I've ever gotten through all the questions. So yeah, I'll be around for like another 10 minutes or so if you guys want to private message me or something. If you want to, you can message me on Instagram as well. I can't give any like professional advice on Instagram because it's not a platform. I'm not your therapist or anything like that. But I can help point you in the right direction, or if you have some general questions, we can talk about that as well. So feel free to DM me if needed. yeah, I think that's about it. Is there anything else, Victoria? No?
Nope, that's great. Thanks, Nina. Did you want to just tell us a little bit about your Instagram in the meantime? We still have
Sure.
a couple of minutes left. I'll put it in the...
Okay. Yeah, I run an Instagram account called wholehearted.growth. It's essentially just what I do in my spare time to help educate people about their emotional well-being. I think we don't know and we're not taught a lot about our own emotions, especially if we come from families that don't talk about our emotions. So talk a lot about feelings. I talk a lot about mental well-being, emotional well-being, that kind of thing. So yeah, if you want to check it out, you can go ahead. If you want to message me, all good as well. That's about it. Thank you guys for coming on here. It was great to chat with you, or one-sided chat.
Thanks so much, Nina, for being here. Yeah, so we're just going to hang out for a couple of minutes. Okay, so actually, we're going to close this breakout room. I think the other groups are done as well. So we'll see you guys in the main session. And yeah, we'll continue on with the rest of the program.